Hi, folks. Me again. Now, I have a couple of stories to tell about Toronto in the 1930s. Now, these are stories that come from my mother and father, and these are stories my brothers and I would hear over the kitchen table as we were growing up. Now, thing to know, my parents, both of them were born in 1921, so exactly 100 years ago now this year. And they lived all their lives in Toronto. And so I've got deep roots to Toronto, and my mom's mother had been born in Toronto back in the 1880s. So we have deep roots in Toronto. Now, a couple of stories about Toronto. This ties into immigration and ties into the Jewish experience in Toronto in the 1920s, 1930s. First off, a quick story that my dad would tell. And dad would always say he was ashamed. He was ashamed of himself as a young boy, when thinking back what he was like as a young boy and he and his other friends. Now, dad grew up in the east end of Toronto, and it was very much a British, English, working class neighborhood, but few immigrants in the east end of Toronto, certainly not in the neighborhood my dad was growing up in. So in the 1920s and 1930s, there would be Jewish used clothes salespeople going around neighborhoods. Now they were called sheenies. The nickname they had was sheenies. And now they would be guys, Jewish guys, making a living, selling used clothes and other household appliances. Now they would be going around with a horse and wagon, and they would have their goods for sale in the wagon, and there'd be a horse, and they'd go through the up and down the streets, this wagon, and a Jewish guy leading the horse, and then he'd be ringing a bell. He'd be ringing a bell to let the homeowners know that he was coming, and he would have used clothes. He would have used clothes and household appliances. They'd be able to sharpen knives, household knives. So there was always some little business they could pick up in selling used clothes and even buying used clothes and make being merchants. My dad would tell the story that when he and his buddies, when they were like 10, 9, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, when they would hear the guy coming with the bell, my dad and his buddies would go out and pick up rocks and stones, and they would pelt the Jewish merchants with stones and force them off of their street. Force the guy to run and get the horse running to get the wagon off of the street. So here, my dad, as a young boy, would throw stones at Jewish men. Dad later on was appalled at his behavior. And Dad went on to fight in the Second World War and helped to fight against the Nazis. He would say he was always appalled, always ashamed of himself and his behavior back then. Now, my mom would then pick up the story and tell her side of the story of what it was like growing up now in dealing with these Jewish merchants. Now, my mom grew up in the west end of Toronto. Now, my grandfather, her father was Scottish, came over in 1912, and her mother was English, so they were British. But living in the west end of Toronto, living in a Italian neighborhood, largely Italian neighborhoods are largely surrounded by Italian immigrants. And so this neighborhood was much more used to immigrants and much more willing to accept Jewish merchants. And so Mum's story would be the Sheenies coming down the street, ringing their bells and selling their goods. That Mum said they always looked forward to meeting the Jewish merchants, and they got to know this one guy, Mr. Mandel. And so, okay, like dad never knew the name of the guys that he was pitching rocks at. But in the West End, my mom and my grandmother got to know Mr. Mandel, the Jewish used clothes salesman. And now the other thing to know, my grandmother was a very accomplished pianist, piano player, and she was very good at playing popular songs. And my grandmother would actually make some monies playing at in church bazaars and church events and neighborhood events when they needed somebody to play the piano. And my grandmother was very good. So they said, this mom would say this one day, the Mr. Mandel is coming down the street with his horse and buggy, and he hears my grandmother playing the piano. It's a summer day, the windows are open, and he hears my grandmother playing the piano. And so then eventually she comes out, she hears the bell, and she comes out, and then he says to her, "Oh, yeah, Mrs. Murray," that was their name, family name, Mrs. Murray. "Oh, Mrs. Murray, was that you playing the piano?" And Grandma said, "Yeah, yeah." You know, he said, "Oh, you're very good. You're very good. I'd like to. I'd like. I enjoy. I heard the amazing music. You play very well." And so Grandma said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." And then Grandma said, "Oh, Mr. Mandel, do you play an instrument?" And he said, "Oh, yes, yes. I." And she said, What instrument do you play?" He said, "Oh, I could play the violin." And, oh yeah, the mom's grandma said, "Oh yeah, that's nice. That's no. Next time you're coming by, you bring your violin, and maybe we could play a concert for the kids, all the kids in the neighborhood." I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, he'd be happy to do that." So then, a few days later, a week or so later, they hear the Mr. Mandel coming down the street again with his bell and his horse, and the grandma gets all the kids together from the neighborhood and oh, Mr. Mandel. And then he had his fiddle. He had his fiddle case. And so Mr. Mandel, they got into their living room, all the kids there, and then they began playing. They just began playing some music. Grandma on the piano, Mr. Mandel playing his violin. And then Mom would always say, again, they realized that this Mr. Mandel was excellent. He could play anything, and he was playing the popular music. But Mom said, yeah, Grandma quickly realized that Mr. Mandel was far, far, far better as a playing the fiddle than she could play the piano. And she was good, but he was far better. And so then it said after if they played a few tunes, Grandma said to Mr. Mandel, "Wow, you are really good." And then he said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." And then she said, "Where did you learn to play the violin as good as you can?" And he said, "Oh, well," then she was speaking English with an accent. Said, "Oh, well, he learned back in Europe." And Grandma said, "Well, where? Where in Europe? Where are you from?" He said, "Vienna, Austria, Vienna." Now, this is mid 1930s. "Oh, Austria, Vienna." And wow, she said, "Wow, you're excellent." And then she said, "Well, where did you play back in Vienna?" And he said, "I played with the Vienna State Philharmonic, the orchestra, the key orchestra in Vienna." And then she said, "Well, what are you doing here in Toronto selling used clothes?" Said, "Well, they had to leave. They realized they had to leave. The right wing, the Nazis were taking over, and they thought it was better to leave than to stay. And so they packed up. He and his family. They were able to get out. Well, the getting was good, and they came to Canada. And the Toronto Symphony wouldn't hire him because he's Jewish back then, and so well he had to make money. So he was making money selling used clothes. But again, just imagine. And so that's my mom and my grandmother very much liking these meeting these people, these Jewish people, these Jewish immigrants. And at the time, my dad throwing rocks at them. Two little stories from Toronto, a sense of what Toronto was like in the 1930s. Anyway, I'll have a few more of these little reminiscences as the course goes on. In the meantime, you guys take care, and I'll be coming at you again shortly.